What I'd like to do tonight is look at Mexico during the colonial period and take a look at this sort of multicultural traditions that evolve in Mexico during the colonial period. And also to look at how international Mexico was during this period, which is something that we probably don't think of often. The map here shows that all of the area in red is part of the Spanish Empire, or all of this area were colonies of Spain during the colonial period. And everyone remembers that when Columbus sailed for the King and Queen of Spain, he was not at all looking for the Americas, but rather he was looking for Asia. And the Portuguese had completely dominated the route to Asia that went around the tip of Africa. And Spain was very covetous of the trade route to Asia, and they wanted a trade route of their own that they could completely dominate. And Columbus convinced Ferdinand and Isabella that you could get to Asia by sailing west. He was right, but there was a big impediment in the way. And after the discovery of the Americas and then the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire in Mexico, which was completed in 1521, and then they went south and conquered the great Inca Empire in Peru in 1533. And after that, they began to look west again because they realized that this actually was not Asia, and that they began to look west. And by 1561, had managed to sail across the Pacific and actually find Asia. And Spain, as a result, conquered and occupied the Philippines. And that conquest was complete by 1565. And immediately they started making plans to establish their own trade route to Asia. And it was a little bit complicated. And what happened was they sailed a fleet of galleons around into the Pacific and basically just left them there to be the Pacific Fleet. And you've probably heard these referred to as the Manila galleons. And they would start in Acapulco. And in fact, that was the entire reason Acapulco was founded, not so we could all go to the beach, but so that there was a safe harbor for these ships. And these galleons would sail in a fleet, and they would leave from Acapulco and sail over here to the Philippines. And the city of Manila was founded, and a huge trade fair was set up in Manila. And Asian merchants or traders would come then from all over Asia to Manila and have their goods in this market. So Spanish merchants, traders, would sail across, well, from Spain to Mexico, and then from Acapulco to the Philippines. And they would buy all sorts of wonderful goods at this magnificent fair. I always wish I could have been a button on somebody's shirt and seen all this wonderful stuff. But basically porcelains, ivories, silks, spices, and all sorts of Asian decorative arts. We'll look at some in a minute. Because of the prevailing trade winds, they could not sail straight back across the Pacific. They had to sail north past the coast of Japan and across the northern Pacific to San Francisco Bay, and then from there down the west coast to Acapulco. In good years, when there were not wars and pirate attacks and hurricanes and typhoons, I guess, in the Pacific, these fleets would arrive in Acapulco every 6 months. And Acapulco was really nothing but this beautiful bay, and every 6 months it would start to fill up with people who would come and sort of camp out around Acapulco Bay waiting for the fleet to come in. And then everything would be offloaded there, off of the boats, off of the ships, and then it would be loaded onto mules and be hauled overland from Acapulco to Mexico City for sale in the Americas, or to Veracruz on the east coast of Mexico. And in the port of Veracruz, these goods, some of them very fragile, would be loaded onto Atlantic galleons for the trip across the Atlantic to Spain, assuming they could get through the French, Dutch, and English pirates who were marauding around in the Atlantic looking specifically for Spanish galleons full of expensive trade goods or gold and silver from the Americas. And many of these ships were captured by pirates and looted, and the ships themselves would be taken. So it was quite a journey. It was quite a journey, but many of these wonderful trade goods made it to Spain. However, many goods remained in Mexico and made their way from Mexico to Peru and other areas of colonial Latin America. And Mexico and Peru both were relatively wealthy at most of the colonial period because of the gold and silver mines there. So an enormous amount of these wonderful Asian goods that were quite exotic at the time to Europeans and people of European descent remained in Mexico. There's a scholar who estimated that there was more Chinese porcelain in Mexico in around 1700 than there was in Spain. That's kind of one of the things I want to talk about this evening. But I'm going to back up. And among the pre-Columbian cultures of Mexico, there had been a long tradition of making art that was covered with a mosaic of cut stone, turquoise and obsidian, and shell. These are two examples. Most of the cultures in Mexico, at least the major cultures of pre-Columbian periods, had a tradition of this mosaic or inlay work. The image on the right is from the classic culture of Teotihuacan, and it's a stone mask covered with turquoise. Everything that's white is shell. The black is obsidian, the blue is turquoise, and then the orange, some of it is coral, but much of it, particularly the lighter orange, is shell. And then on the left, this is the hilt of a knife. It's an Aztec object. It's now in a museum in Rome. And again, it is covered with turquoise. All the white is shell, and some of the orange is shell. This piece here on the left is actually Toltec, and it is covered entirely with mother of pearl, with a few touches of white shell. And then the piece on the right is at the Denver Art Museum. It's on exhibit on the 4th floor in Margaret's Galleries, and it's a Mayan mask of green stone, and the white is shell, the black is obsidian, and probably most of the mouth is shell as well. So there was this long tradition in Mexico from pre-Columbian cultures of using stone and shell mosaic or inlay. There was also a long tradition in Asia of wonderful decorative arts that were inlaid with mother of pearl. This is a Chinese document box from the 17th century that's in the collection at the Denver Art Museum. And all of the white areas are mother of pearl. Mother of pearl is very hard to photograph because you either get a glare if the light reflects from it, or you get this sort of flat, matte, plain white looking. But they're beautiful objects in real life. And this is a lovely piece. Here's another detail of the document box. And this is a screen. Both of these are Chinese document box. And this is a table screen also from China from the 18th century. And all of the panels here are inlaid with mother of pearl. So there was a long tradition in Asia as well of using shell mosaic or shell inlay. What happened in Mexico during the colonial period is these traditions came together. And the Asian tradition and we don't really know how much of the pre-Columbian tradition influences it, but certainly there was the tradition existed. And in Mexico, an entirely new art form was invented in the colonial period. And because they took the shell mosaic and covered it or overpainted portions of it in the European oil painting tradition. However, they thinned out the oil paints. In other words, they put more oil and less pigment in order to make the oil paints translucent, so you could see the beautiful shine of the mother of pearl from underneath. This is an example. I'm sure many of you remember it. It was in the Painting a New World exhibition, and it's a lovely painting. These types of paintings were called enconchados, which in Spanish means shelled. And they were highly popular in Europe, and they were exported from Mexico in really huge quantities. And there are many more that survive now, today, in Europe than actually in Mexico. And then this particular piece, which represents St. Francis Xavier, who was a Jesuit missionary who actually went to Asia. It shows him setting out for Asia. And here's a detail of his robe, and you can see the bits of shell and then this very thin pigment that overlays it. Let's see. Oops. Let me go back. There. Here's a close-up. St. Francis is actually looking at a map of Asia, and you can see it says China here. And he has a guide with him, and then they are surrounded by these four figures that are allegorical figures that represent the four known continents at the time, and we'll see them again in a minute. But you can see that they are actually labeled. This one is Europe, and it says Europe right down here. This is Africa, and it says Africa above his head. This is America, and this figure represents Asia. This piece is actually signed and dated. It's dated 1703, and it's signed Juan Gonzalez. And many scholars believe that the Gonzalez family, all of whom were enconchado artists, were actually of Japanese descent. And there were a number of Asian artists in particular who immigrated to the Americas because there was work. There was money there, and there was work there. And that's an aspect of colonial history that's not been very well researched yet, but it's a sort of exciting aspect of colonial history. This piece, even the frame, is inlaid with mother of pearl. So all of these, what look like flat white dots, are actually mother of pearl. In some instances, you can see the reflection and the shine. Even the body of the bird and the flower is inlaid with mother of pearl. So this was absolutely an invention in Mexico. Enconchado paintings were never made anywhere else other than Mexico. And it reflects this mixture of cultures. These are some other examples. This one is in the collection of Jan and Frederick Mayer here in Denver. And this one is in a museum in Mexico City. Ron Otsuka and I saw it last week in the Franz Mayer Museum in Mexico City. Here are two others. The one on the left is in the collection of the Denver Art Museum. It's currently on view on the 4th floor, or rather, it's currently on the 4th floor. And when we reopen, you can go see it in October. So remember, in October, when we reopen the museum, go up to the 4th floor and take a look at it. This one is in the same museum that Ron and I visited last week in Mexico City, the Franz Mayer Museum. Now, this is a wonderful painting, and I'm sure many of you remember seeing it in the Painting a New World exhibition. But since that exhibit was over, I've done a little bit more research because I was so fascinated with all the detail going on in this painting in all the different areas. And because this painting is absolutely chock full of all sorts of aspects of daily life, of all different types of people who lived in Mexico during this period. So I'd like to talk about it in a little more detail this evening. What it represents, it has to do with the well-known image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And on the right is a painting, an 18th century painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe that is in the collection of Jan and Frederick Mayer here in Denver. And basically, a quick recap of the story is that now the conquest of Mexico ended in 1521. 10 years later, just 10 years after the conquest, the legend is a Christianized Indian named Juan Diego, who lived in a village north of Mexico City, was going to Mass. He went every morning, and he was going to the nearby Franciscan Mission Church to go to Mass. And he was late. We all know that story. And he didn't have the excuse of traffic. But he lived somewhere up in these hills back here, and he was going to the church right here, the Franciscan Mission Church. Since he was late, he needed to go all the way around this hill. But he was late, so he decided to hoof it up over the top of the hill. A harder walk, but a faster, a shortcut. And so he was hiking up over the top of this hill when, according to the legend, a beautiful woman appeared to him, called to him in Nahuatl, the native Aztec language, and she was dark-skinned, and she told him in Nahuatl that she wanted him to go to the Bishop of Mexico City, tell the bishop she wanted a church built for her on top of the hill. Well, this hill is called Tepeyac, and prior to the conquest, it supposedly had a shrine to Tonantzin, the mother goddess of the Aztecs, on top of the hill. So so there's this interface with pre-Hispanic religion. And she told him that. The story is that he went to the bishop received him, listened to his story, and said, well, that's a real nice story, but I need proof. And so the next day, he was going on his way to Mass, and he was trying to avoid her because he felt like he had failed this beautiful woman. But she found him, and he told her what happened, and she said, well, not to worry, just go pick all those beautiful roses that are growing right over there. Well, this was December, and so it was out of season for roses. Also, roses are not native to the Americas. They had been introduced by the Spanish. So he picked the roses, and he gathered them in his tilmaro, or his native cloak, shortened usually during the colonial period to tilma. And it was a maguey fiber cloak, and he gathered the roses in his cloak, went to the bishop, and when he opened his cloak to show the roses to the bishop, imprinted on the front of his cloak was an image of the beautiful woman, the beautiful, now known as the Virgin of Guadalupe. So the bishop right away believed, and he said that he would have a church built on top of the hill. And he did. This is not actually the church he had built. This one replaced that one a little bit later. What happened over the years is the Virgin of Guadalupe became identified with Mexico and people living in Mexico and Mexicans because she appeared on American soil. She was dark-skinned. She spoke Nahuatl, and to this day, she is identified with Mexico and people who live in Mexico. But she became so popular, and actually really quickly, that by the late 1600s, they decided she needed a new and bigger church. So they began to build this church right here. And here it is. It still exists today. In fact, all three of these churches exist today. Here it is. And what's happening in this painting, this is the day of the inauguration of the new church. In the meantime, the actual tilma, Juan Diego's maguey fiber cloak, is the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, supposedly. It still exists. It was in the small church here, and so they had to move it to the new church, this very revered image taken from his cloak. And so what's happening in this painting is they are actually moving the image from this church to this church. Let's see. Oops, no, back up. Here's a close-up. So it was up here, and what they have done is taken the image in a procession, gone down the hill. You can still walk this path today, down the hill here, back here, and here they come out this side of the church here. And then the procession goes around here and then comes over here, and it's stopped. And here she is. Here is Juan Diego's cloak in a beautiful frame with flowers all around it, and they've stopped for a minute on the procession, and there's a choir here that was waiting, and the choir is singing to her. And there's a cellist. See the cello here? There's a harpist. You see the harp here? And here's the choir director who's resting his hand on the head of the little boy that's holding his sheet music for him, and the choir with all of their mouths open here. And all around, there's all sorts of activity going on, and there are all sorts of people. People of all different ethnic backgrounds, people of all different levels in society, and all sorts of different fun things going on. Oops. Not yet. Here. Down below, here she is right here, and down below here, this river is here. Actually, it still exists, although it's been all, it's got cement sides on it now. But right here, it looks like these are just a bunch of boys skinny dipping and having fun and being rowdy and not being very respectful. But the majority of them are actually swimming over here and looking up the street at her. That's the bottom of her right here. And see them in the water here with their hands held in prayer. So the majority of them are going over there to get a good view, because obviously it's hard with all the crowds, and we'll see other evidence of that in just a minute. Now, just over here on the bridge here, here's a group of people, and here are two Indian women, and they are wearing their traditional, traditional Indian woman's overblouse called a huipil, which many Indians in Mexico still wear today, and the tourists buy them. We've all probably got one. And then a group of men dressed in different clothing, but the women in their traditional clothing, and we'll talk again about the huipil in a few minutes. In addition, right over here on the roof of this building, there is a group of Asian immigrants dressed in traditional clothing and with the parasols on the roof of the building. Asians who did immigrate to the Americas had to convert to Christianity. And so these would be Asians who were now Christians, and on the roof here. And I just want to point out the riot police down here, engaged in crowd control. And because this is this corner right here where the Virgin has just gone by. So here's the riot police keeping back the people here who are trying to crowd on. Now, behind, here's the image of the Virgin here. Behind the Virgin, there's this sort of fenced-off churchyard, and there's all sorts of people waiting here for the after procession. There was the procession, very solemn, to the church. They had Mass, and then after the church, had a wild, fun procession afterwards. And I had a good friend in New Mexico who told me once that the Spanish Catholic theory was, in Spanish he called it misa y mesa, which literally translated means Mass and table. But what the implication is you go to Mass and it's solemn, and then you party hardy afterwards. And that was indeed what would have happened. So these people are waiting for the after procession, which would be not so solemn. And these figures here look oversized. It looks like the artist didn't understand perspective, but that's not true. They are these figures known as gigantes or cabezudos, which means, and they're still used in Spain today. You still see them in processions in Spain and all over Latin America. And they are giants, really, giant figures that are worn by people underneath. So they're these giant frameworks that are dressed like giant papier-mâché figures for processions and for parades. Here, they usually are allegorical or historical figures, and it's still done today. I saw one just a couple of years ago in Barcelona, and it had different kings and queens from the Barcelona area, different historical figures, allegorical figures as well. But here it represents the four continents, and we saw that before. And this it's always couples, always couples. This couple with the turbans represent Asia. This couple represents Europe. These represent Africa. And this couple here represent America. And you'll notice that the man is wearing this sort of cloak tied up over one shoulder, the traditional tilma. The woman is wearing a huipil, the traditional woman's overblouse. And the man is wearing this distinctive type of headdress. And this is a portrait of Montezuma, the last ruler of the Aztecs. And this painting was in the Painting in the World show as well. And you'll see that he wears the same type of headdress with this sort of strange upright bill in the front. The Aztec name for this type of headdress was shortened in the colonial period to copili, and that's what it was called throughout the colonial period. But this headdress was reserved for Aztecs of the nobility, for noble Aztecs. And so you see Montezuma wearing it, and you see this gentleman wearing it here. Montezuma here has a spear or a javelin. The gentleman here holds a type of weapon that was called in the colonial period, a macana, macahuitl in the Aztec and the Nahuatl language, which in the colonial period became distinctive of, or sort of iconic of, Aztecs. And it was a wooden club lined with obsidian blades. And they were apparently very effective. There are descriptions during the conquest of Mexico of horses being decapitated with one blow by a macana. Whether that's true or not, who knows, but there are descriptions of that by Spanish conquistadors. So this has become sort of the iconic, in the colonial period, the iconic costume representing Aztecs. And then behind these figures, the giant figures, there is a float that looks like a dragon and being pulled on a cart by people dressed as little devils. This was also something that was done in the pre-Hispanic period. They had these sort of dragon-like monster figures known as tarascas, particularly in the Michoacan area and the Valley of Mexico. But of course it overlaps with the European dragon from the Middle Ages. And then just over here, to this side of the gigantes, there's something very interesting going on. There are a group of people who are actually dancing. See this gentleman's feet? Dancing a quote-unquote Aztec dance in honor of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And this was actually quite common throughout the colonial period. And the majority of the figures are dressed much like Montezuma, with the cape and with these headdresses. This figure, in fact, represents Montezuma. And this type of dance was called a tecontin. And in addition, aside from these figures representing Aztec nobility, there are figures that represent Aztec warriors, the eagle and jaguar knights, the famous eagle and jaguar knights of the pre-Hispanic period. And all of these are dressed in jaguar. These people are dressed in jaguar uniforms. It's easiest to see on this figure here, who also holds the macana, the wooden club with the obsidian blades, and has a jaguar suit and sort of a jaguar helmet on. This was done as early as, and I'm not sure how good this slide is. I'm not sure you'll be able to see it here, but this is a codex or that was done in the pre-Hispanic style, but in the early colonial period. It's the Codex of Tlatelolco, and it shows the ceremony to dedicate the Cathedral of Mexico, actually the laying of the cornerstone, the first stone being laid. And it documents the viceroy here, the bishop, actually archbishop by then, here, and the 4 Indian governors of the 4 Indian districts of Mexico City. The Spanish left the Indian government pretty much in place, and they just put themselves over it. So these are the 4 Indian governors of Mexico City, and right here is an eagle warrior and 2 jaguar warriors who are dancing to celebrate the dedication of the laying the first stone for the new Mexico City Cathedral. This is something that occurred throughout the colonial period. Now, Nope. All right. What happens is the procession will continue, and all these people are lined up here right outside the door of the church. Oh, I know. Wait a minute. Sorry. Aha. There. Okay. Sorry. I forgot to say that all these people in their dancing, they danced to drums and the traditional Aztec drum. And see these 2 people here? This is a young boy who's got his hands over his ears because he has a wooden drum strapped to his back, and an old man is playing the drum. That's the music that the dance is happening to. This is one of those drums. This happens to be a vertical one, or a huehuetl, and this survives in the National Museum in Mexico City. They're beautifully carved wooden drums. There were 2 types, the vertical ones like this for stationary ceremonies, and then horizontal ones, such as this one, which are called teponatzli. And you see it's cut through here, so this part vibrates and makes the drum sound. And that's what this is on the back of the boy here. And the gentleman is playing it. There. Okay. Yeah. All right. Now the procession will continue along this path here, and see the people lined up to watch the procession. And it comes right to the pedestal of this cross here, and then it will go, the doors will open, and the procession will continue into the church, install the image of the Virgin on its new altar in the church. This cross right here still exists. This is it. It still exists today, and it was a stone cross, the type that was done in the very early colonial period, before many of the churches were even built, and then remained a tradition throughout the 16th century. They were usually erected outdoors, and so they're usually referred to as atrium crosses because they were in the atrium of a church. And they are usually carved with elements that are known as the instruments of the Passion. And it's all things that had to do with the Passion of Christ, the week leading up to the crucifixion of Christ. And some of the more obvious ones are, this is the crown of thorns draped around it here. These are the nails for the hands and blood droplets. This is the nail for the feet with the blood droplets. This is the column of the flagellation. So these were used presumably to teach the new converts about Christianity. But it does still exist, and there it is in the painting. And then on this side here, you'll see these groups of people lined up, ready to sort of join the procession. And they are carrying large statues of saints. This one represents Santiago, or St. James, the patron saint of Spain, who's always on a white horse. This is St. Augustine, and this is St. Anthony. And those were 3 important churches in Mexico City at the time. But interestingly, the Church of Santiago was the Church of Santiago Tlatelolco, and it was in the largest and most important entirely Indian neighborhood of Mexico City. And their church was named for St. James, Santiago Tlatelolco, still is today. And so I suspect that this is the contingent representing the Indian neighborhood of Tlatelolco, coming to pay honor to the Virgin of Guadalupe. This is not the statue from that church, but this is from another Indian church in a small Indian village just northeast of Mexico City. And you can see how similar it is in size and imagery. And you can see that this one also is on its litter with these sticks for carrying, with these long boards for carrying it in procession. Now, further over here, we have the parking lot right here, and they had the same issues we have, it looks like, although they had probably somewhat belligerent animals to deal with at times as well. And then the last thing I want to talk about in this painting is right smack dab in the middle of the painting, very tiny, but in the middle of the painting is the man who commissioned the painting. He was the viceroy at the time, in 1709, when this dedication occurred. He was the Duke of Albuquerque. 3 years earlier, the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, had been founded in 1706 and named for him. He commissioned this painting, and then when he left, when he finished his tour of duty as viceroy and returned to Spain, he took it with him. And, oops, gosh. He is right here, way back here, right in the middle of the painting. This is the Duke of Albuquerque, the viceroy, with his wife, their young daughter, and some ladies in waiting. And they are dressed in their finest clothes for the event, which gives me the excuse to talk about clothes in a minute, fashions. But before I move on, I just want to point out that all three of these churches exist, but the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe is no longer in this church of 1709. A new church was built right here in the 1960s, and the image has been moved to it. This is the church. It's been somewhat controversial because it's very modern, but the exterior is not gorgeous. The interior is just spectacular. Again, it's very modern, but this is the image right here of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and it has this magnificent ceiling that's all wood, and it just sweeps up into this giant skylight. Crowd control was an issue because the Virgin of Guadalupe is so immensely popular. And it's a brilliantly designed to be able to deal with crowd control. I was just there for the 100th time probably about a month and a half ago. And it was during Mass, it was during High Mass on a Sunday. And you come in and you can go in a door over here. And then you come in right here and you go down some stairs here. And then you get on an escalator that takes you right behind this red wall. And then you come out the stairs over here and go out a side door. And it was in the middle of Mass. And nobody who's at Mass can see you. They don't really see you. You're behind the white wall, and then you're behind the red wall, but you're right there. I mean, she's just right there. It's really dramatic, and it's a brilliant design for a church that had to deal with crowd control and these types of problems, and the acoustics are wonderful. And as we were going along in the escalator, suddenly the organ starts and the choir starts singing, and it was really, really quite impressive. Okay. Now, many of you, I'm sure, remember these two paintings. They were also in the Painting a New World show. The one on the left is in the collection of Jan and Frederick Mayer. The one on the right is in that same museum that Ron and I just went to in Mexico City. And we know these are two women who lived in Mexico City in the 1700s. And we know from the inscriptions pretty much all about them. The woman on the left, according to the inscription, her father was a pureblood Spaniard, her mother was African. And so she is a mulatto woman, and she lived in Mexico City in 1711. The woman on the right is a full-blood Indian woman descended from Aztec nobility. And she lived in Mexico City in 1757. And in both cases, they are dressed in a white chemise undergarment typical of the Spanish, with lace around the cuffs and the neckline, with three-quarter or long sleeves. And probably this one definitely has a European bodice here. And I'm sure with full skirts typical of European style of clothing. But over their European clothing, they both wear garments that indicate their ethnic background. This type of garment is called a manga, M-A-N-G-A, and it's a lot like a very full skirt with a waistband, but yet it's worn at the neck instead of the waist. And this type of garment, and then it ties with these long ties on each side. This type of garment was worn exclusively by women of African descent. And not only do we know this from paintings, but we also know it from descriptions, from the documents. So it's backed up. What we see in the painting is backed up from descriptions from the time period that women wore these mangas, African women, or women of African descent. The Indian woman is wearing a traditional Indian huipil with the vertical panels in it over her Spanish or European style blouse or chemise. And interestingly, this appears to be drawn work, and it's hard to see in the slide, but it has images of the Habsburg double-headed eagle all over it. So it's a funny mixed message here. You have things that are very, very Spanish, and then things that are very obviously Native American. Her jewelry is also a mix of Spanish jewelry and Native American jewelry from the time period. It's interesting to me that these women choose to wear these types of garments. Nobody's forcing them to wear garments that indicate their ethnic background. So to me, it's a sign that they are sort of negotiating their identity and their status within colonial society based on their heritage, all of their heritage. So it's interesting to see. Now, speaking of clothing, one of the things imported from Asia were incredibly wonderful silks from Asia. Beautiful silk clothing embroidered, and let me see if I can, is that better? Yeah. And these actually are garments imported, garments made from silk imported from Asia, or garments made in Asia. So all of this is Asian fabric. And these have survived in museums and private collections in Mexico. On the right is a portrait of an upper-class woman in Mexico wearing what is probably Chinese silk with these wonderful Chinese-like designs on the bottom. So wealthy people bought the silks, but people of all classes wore another type of fabric imported from Asia. And that is a type of printed cotton that was made in India, on the east coast of India, mostly on the coast of India. What many of us grew up calling Madras, because it's one of the areas that it's from, these printed cottons. This is a type of coat, house coat worn by men. These were imported, already made. It's a banyan coat. And then this is a type of skirt made from this printed cotton. In Spanish, it's called indianilla, and it is just throughout the documents. And it appears not only again in paintings, but it's supported tremendously by the documents. Here is a skirt that survives in a museum in Puebla, Mexico, made entirely of this indianilla fabric. Here's a woman wearing a indianilla skirt, and then the traditional Indian woman's overblouse, the huipil, over it. Here's an African woman wearing a skirt from indianilla fabric. Here's another. Here are two more skirts that survive in a museum in Mexico. So not only it was not only the rich people who got imports from Asia, but people of all classes. These are two examples of indianilla. And these are just some details from portraits. And the last thing I want to do is take one motif, actually two motifs, and I actually, I think that things in the minor arts, like textiles and things, influenced other arts tremendously, more than has ever been acknowledged. And I want to just take two motifs and look at those, and even look at their influence here in the Southwest in the United States as late as the 19th century. Very typical of Asian decorative arts, textiles and other arts, are these motifs that are often called C scrolls, as in the letter C. You can see the big letter C here. Here's another one up here. And you see on this rich guy's jacket, see the sort of C shapes around. And also something else that's called a leaf scroll. And here's one here. Sometimes the C scroll is very leafy. So leaf scroll and C scroll. And these were also used not just in textiles, but in porcelains, Chinese porcelains as well. And this little piece, these are pieces of a broken, obviously, teacup. And these pieces were, in the 1970s, excavated from the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they had been there and been broken and been thrown in a trash pit before 1680 in Santa Fe. So, you know, we think of our part of the world, what's now New Mexico and Colorado, as being too remote to have had these imported Asian trade goods back then, but that's not true. They did exist. Lots of porcelains appear in excavations from the colonial period in the Southwest, as well as all these textiles show up in wills and estate inventories that people wore Chinese silks, and they wore the Indiania here in the Southwest. And these motifs eventually show up in the art of the Southwest. Let's see, what's here? Yeah. And these are two retablos or santos, images of saints, done in northern New Mexico or southern Colorado in the around 1800, more or less. And typically, in some instances, they appear exactly, these C scrolls, exactly where they're supposed to, and that's on fabrics, on textiles. But that's not always the case. Let's see. Here's an example of a leaf scroll on a carved image of a saint from the Southwest. And they also appear in the textiles of the Southwest. This is a beautiful bed covering done in the colcha embroidery style, typical of New Mexico and southern Colorado. This piece, with these wonderful leafy C scrolls, this piece was done in the late 1700s, and it was collected in southern Colorado, down by the New Mexico border. Here's another example that came from Taos with the leafy C scrolls. And also, you see C scrolls in, not just on fabrics, but I mean not just on textile areas in these paintings, but also in, as decorative elements. And we have a wonderful one at the Denver Art Museum with huge leaf scrolls. And this is on the 4th floor at the Denver Art Museum. It's attributed to the artist Pedro Antonio Fresquis, and what it was the top section of an altar screen in a church or chapel in northern New Mexico during the colonial period, but with these wonderful, huge leaf scrolls underneath the Trinity. So when we finally reopen in the fall, go back to the 4th floor and see this. Thank you.